Good morning, everybody, and thanks to Steve and the organisers for an opportunity to talk, and also for the previous speakers. Fantastic presentations already. So I am John Cooper. I was in the fuels industry for many years, actually since 1988. I had a few years in the auto industry before then in the company that was now Jaguar Land Rover. And the last 9 years I've been in Brussels dealing with politics and the science behind politics. Great position, FuelsEurope and Konkawi actually is the title. Now I think there's some Slido questions here, which you're invited to answer, and I guess we can get answers pretty quickly. So, asking you here on two questions. The first one is, should there be any role at all for sustainable fuels in road transport? So I invite you to have a go at that one. Okay, 93%. Well, I think that's a pretty much consensus. Right, and the next one, here's an interesting one. And you'll see why I ask this later. If so, should this be only for a transition period or for the long term? I'll give you a minute for that one. While you're doing that, let me just say, so my time in Brussels was quite interesting. Being an engineer, having to then have to actually communicate and engage with the political community it's a change you have to adapt to, yeah? I reported to a board that was made up of mostly the CEOs of major oil and gas companies. But in fact, most of my time while I was there, we were talking about what we can do in terms of the energy transition. So biofuels, synthetic fuels, CCS, hydrogen, etc., and how we can get the recognition for that in different regulations. And I'm now just one, while you're just thinking and answering on that, quick story. After the Green Deal was announced in Brussels around 2016, 2017, one of the things I would hear several times was from commissioners, they would say to us, well, we know that your industry will need to close down. Which is a difficult thing to put back to the board meeting. But within a month of the terrible invasion of Ukraine, I had meetings with the European Commission, and one of the statements was, well, yes, we will need your industry to close down. But in the meantime, can you please produce some more diesel? Anyway, so for the long term, 72%, very good, thank you, interesting. So let's give you some thoughts behind those questions and some experience that I've had. So, right, conflict or synergy. Could there be a long, and should there be a long-term role for sustainable fuels? I'm now independent. I retired from the industry about a year ago. Right, and what I'd like to talk about is, should we have a strategy actually for liquid fuels? One of the key questions is, of course, what is the potential? Because we hear again and again, there's not enough, there never will be. So let's dig into that a little bit. I'd like to give you an update. We do tend to have, since Brexit, a conversation in the UK that is very UK-centric and not enough connected to the EU. But I'm sure Andy would tell us, actually, the auto industry is pan-European, and in fact, obviously has deep connections to both US and China as well now. So we have to think in a broader sense. And then some thoughts about the synergy with electrification. A thought, an observation, and this is actually from a study from Stanford University, but frankly, you only really have to go outside and look. Only 90%, something like 90% of global transportation is fueled by liquid fuels today. And it's amazed me over the last few years that we still don't have a transition for the strategy, a political, an industrial strategy for liquid fuels transition. We, quite rightly so, have a very strong electrification agenda, absolutely the right thing to do. We also have a hydrogen agenda, again, absolutely the right thing to do. But if you started doing Venn diagrams, you could easily represent, actually, they need to interlink. And yet there is nothing in terms of an overall strategy for the whole liquid fuels industry. And I'm talking about Europe as well as the UK. I'm going to pick from some of the work that Konkawi did while I was there, and this is taken from a very long report with lots of work, and a lady called Marta Hugo who put this graph together. And this gives an idea. We've tried to explain, I can walk, right? If you read from the right-hand side, availability potential of biofuels, advanced biofuels for transport 2050. And it's divided into different sectors. So the blue dotted line at the bottom goes out to 2050, and that shows what's needed and what's possible to do aviation and maritime sectors across Europe and the UK. The next green line up, if you add in heavy duty, that would take you to, see that number 100? That's 100 million tons of oil equivalent. And for all transport, and let me explain this one, about 160 million tons. We assumed for all transport in 2050 that something like half of it would be electrified. And we are saying, actually, that's what you would need. And in fact, it's within the realm of possibility. We could get between 70 and 175 million tons of oil equivalent. So that's roughly 25 to 50% of what we use in crude oil today. There is no way you can replace crude oil completely. Let's be clear. So how would you do that? And I'm not going to go through this chart. The core thing here is that you've got a wide range of feedstocks and a wide range of conversion technologies. And this is where, in some of these, actually you may choose to take some of this out as a gas, as hydrogen, or feedstock to make hydrogen, and where you start to have a mixed business model across different things. In terms of the feedstock availability, 3 different studies represented on this graph here. In terms of the feedstock to actually replace crude oil, that would be your red line there. And to be clear, that is extremely ambitious. But 3 different studies show that significant volumes of liquid fuels can be made from biomass, European biomass, if you have the technologies available. But there are 2 issues. It's the technology and it's also the aggregation logistics. The great thing about crude oil is that you can drill a hole and you can get millions of tons out of the ground in one place. If you're talking about biomass, it tends to be accumulated in quite small piles. And so you need to think and develop a supply chain over years to get it aggregated. In terms of the technology readiness level, this is a complex chart, I don't expect you to read it, but the most important thing is, look at the top section there. That is the biofuels we have today, first generation biofuels. They are all at TRL 9. Most of the growth in feedstock is going to come from lower quality. If you think about it, it's relatively straightforward to take a vegetable oil and turn it into something like diesel. It's already liquid, you can run it through processes, etc. If you start taking waste wood, it's a long journey from waste wood chips to something that looks like jet fuel. And so you need more technology. Most of those are around 5 or 6. So that means all of them have got pilot plants working today, but they're all making a few barrels a day rather than a few thousand tons. Why is the supply of sustainable fuel limited then? So my first statement here, there's not enough biofuels, is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you keep saying we won't develop them, there's not going to be enough, we can do it all with electrification, the industry that could invest will simply say, fine, we won't. And that's what's happening. In order to grow the business, you need to move to lower quality biomass. There's huge amounts available, but you need to have part of your liquid fuel strategy is a technology strategy to boost all of those conversion technologies up to TRL 9. And with that, grow your supply chains. The fuels industry, I used to be sitting in front of people that could sign off billion-dollar investments, and they did that regularly. What do they need to do this? Well, they need long-term contracts. And that means a long-term vision. And if you have politicians standing up every day saying that the only thing we need is full electrification, it is a turn-off. I'll be quite honest, it's a turn-off. We are being told aviation SAF is the one thing we need. Yes, and the industry is doing some of that, but the aviation industry is quite a difficult industry to use as a backing for long-term investment. I was in New Jersey when 9/11 happened. I was in Air BP, the fuel division for BP that supplies aviation. Within 6 months, every airline in the US had gone bankrupt. Everyone had gone bankrupt. They walked away from every long-term contract and every debt that they had. Aviation companies, you look at the market capitalization of Lufthansa, I think they're about 9 billion today. That's one of the biggest. They are not big enough to cope with the balance sheet of long-term contracts for SAF. If you want this to happen, you really need some road demand as well. Maritime is kind of now a bit divorced from this because they're going to probably first-gen biodiesel, methanol, and LNG. It doesn't really link into the rest of the infrastructure for fuels. And the ICE ban, if your demand will ultimately go to zero, why would you invest? That's what's going on in the boardrooms today. To me, there's an obvious long-term role here for PHEVs and some heavy-duty vehicles alongside, probably at the lightest end, you'd have electrification. You'd have on probably well-established routes, hydrogen would work very well. There's also a sector of HDVs that has to be really flexible. And you can put renewable fuels into tens of thousands of pumps across Europe tomorrow. It's worth looking at what's the policy landscape here. So this is the European, but UK has got some read across. The emissions trading scheme for all the point sources in industry today, if you put biomass into a power station or a stationary source, you actually get it rated as 0 CO2 straight away, strangely, which is also not correct. Emissions trading for road and buildings, it's the only time R&B comes into regulation. But that is coming in Europe very soon, and is a levy, essentially, or a trading scheme. It also treats this as 0 CO2. Renewable Energy Directive correctly uses a kind of a life cycle basis. The RTFO in the UK is related to that. CO2 in cars and HDVs? No. Any fuel that has any carbon is treated as if it's fossil carbon. You can have the best synthetic fuel in the world. No, it's treated like fossil. Fuel EU Maritime, which is, obviously related to doing cars and vehicles, properly uses a low carbon, a life cycle assessment basis for treating the regulation. And Refuel Aviation the same. And there's another thing, when you compare these regulations here versus cars, nobody's saying that the aircraft maker is responsible for the CO2 emissions over the life of the car. It's the energy supplier and the user that is obligated. So on a number of counts, the CO2 regulation for cars and trucks is a real anomaly, both in terms of the methodology and who's the obligated party. And it's driving us into this strategy where you ignore a big section of what you can do, what you need to do. Just in terms of what's happening in Europe, and this was a big part of my day job up until a year ago, pushing the fact that actually we want a proper technology neutral, a proper life cycle based regulation for transport, is now actually recognized and supported by the Commission President. That doesn't mean we're going to get there yet, though. There is a review in Q3, Q4 this year. There's a number of member states, and this list is growing, that are completely supportive of this. The parties that came with a substantial lead in the German elections are now also supporting at least 4 e-fuels. For some reason, parts of Germany don't like biofuels, but they like e-fuels. That's a whole other story. Around half of the members of the European Parliament are supportive, and some car and truck makers are supportive. Another thing that I was involved with recently, there's been a piece of work done that was started by Bosch. The question is, if we are going to sell cars or trucks with 100% renewable fuel supply over the life, how do you assure that? Well, that work, it was called the Working Group on Monitoring Methodologies, and it had about 6 or 7 members of ASEA present, most of the fuel makers, and lots of parts and tier 1 suppliers, initially led by Bosch. And there's a document that's available now that has been presented to the European Commission, and essentially, here is your method for how you link fuels and vehicles reliably. Most likely, in my view, it's going to be a digital handshake between pumps and vehicles and an associated ledger. We have the technology. If you think about it, you can take cash out of any cash point in most of the Western world, and it comes straight out of your bank account. You can use your mobile phone. We have the technology to do that, to make the link. Lastly, I think this is lastly before my conclusion slide, Konkawi did a big piece of work What happens if we don't have enough batteries in Europe? Well, here we are post-British Volt and Northvolt. Those stories are well known. And we also see a growing capability and interest for China and possibly the US to supply the rest of the world. What happens if we decide we shouldn't take those batteries or we shouldn't take as many? It's fairly obvious if you've got a limited battery supply. This graph here is generous battery supply, very limited battery supply. All EVs, gradually you switch to plug-in hybrids or HEVs. And the obvious thing is you need to have a model to make plug-in hybrids work. And again, to me, there's an obvious thing here is, first of all, develop a system to encourage people to plug in a plug-in hybrid. And then you can make a 30 kilowatt hour battery do almost the job of an 80 kilowatt hour battery. And if you then on top of that say, why not require them to only use renewable fuels, you're as good as an EV. We need a strategy. The investment case for the industry is not there at the moment because you say the internal combustion engine is dead, it's not going to appear in road transport. Aviation and maritime are struggling to be a good case for investment in Europe. And lastly, I would say there's one other thing you should consider here, and that is energy storage. You're never going to beat what you can do with gases and liquids. We currently store 1,000 terawatt hours of gas in Europe, 2,000 terawatt hours of liquid fuels. If we had all the cars in Europe connected and fully charged and used as storage, we could develop something like 20 terawatt hours, which is about 1% of what we store today. We need to do energy storage with molecules, and we need a strategy. I'll leave it there. Thank you.